With Kentucky's decision to not join the Confederacy, Southern military leaders were forced to create key defensive positions along the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers south of the Kentucky border. Forts Henry, Hyman, and Donelson were devised to protect western Tennessee from Union forces using the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers as approach avenues. Unfortunately for the Confederacy, there were few good locations to choose from along the two rivers. Henry Halleck approved General Grant's plan to move swiftly to attack Fort Henry before Confederate reinforcements could arrive. As Grant's two divisions began their march south, gunboats under the command of Flag Officer Andrew H. Foote proceeded down the river to attack the Confederate forts on the Tennessee. In a swift, violent exchange of gunfire, Forts Hyman and Henry quickly fell to the Union gunboats on February 6, 1862. Now consolidated around the two former Confederate forts on the Tennessee River, Grant was determined to move quickly onto the much larger Fort Donelson, located on the nearby Cumberland River. Grant's boast that he would capture Donelson by the 8th of February quickly ran into challenges. Poor winter weather, late arriving reinforcements, and difficulties in moving the ironclads to the Cumberland all delayed Grant's departure for Donelson. Despite being fairly convinced that no earthern fort could withstand the power of the Union gunboats, Confederate General Albert Sidney Johnston allowed the garrison at Fort Donelson to remain and even sent new commanders and reinforcements to the site. On February 11th, Johnston appointed General John B. Floyd as the commander of Fort Donelson and the surrounding region. 17,000 Confederate soldiers combined with improved artillery positions and earthworks convinced Floyd that a hasty retreat was unnecessary. By February 13th, most of Grant's Union soldiers had arrived in the vicinity of Fort Donelson and had begun to arrange themselves around the landward side of the fort. Several inches of snowfall and cold winter winds sent shivers through both armies. With Grant's reinforced army now blocking a landward exit, the Confederate forces knew that they would have to fight their way to freedom. On February 14, 1862, Foote's ironclads moved upriver to bombard Fort Donelson. The subsequent duel between Foote's gunboats and the heavy guns at Fort Donelson led to a Union defeat on the Cumberland. Many of Foote's ironclads were heavily damaged, and Foote himself was wounded in the attack. Grant's soldiers could hear the Confederate cheers as the Union gunboats retreated. While Grant was now contemplating an extended siege, the Confederate leaders had devised a bold plan to move all the forces they could to the Union right and force open a path of escape. Early on the morning of February 15th, the Confederate assault struck the Union right and drove it back from its position on Dudley's Hill. General John McClernand's division attempted to reform their lines, but the ongoing rebel attacks continued to drive his forces to the southeast. Disaster loomed for the Union Army. During the night of the 15th and 16th, Confederate leaders discussed their options. Despite many disagreements, it was determined that surrender was the only viable option for the Confederate Army. More than 13,000 Confederate soldiers remained at Donelson. With a Union attack poised to strike Fort Donelson, the Federal soldiers were surprised to see white flags flying above the Confederate earthworks. General Simon B. Buckner, now left in command, met with General Grant to determine the terms of surrender. Buckner, who was hoping for generous terms from his old West Point friend, was disappointed to get Grant's response, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender can be accepted. I propose to move immediately upon your works." The great Union victory at Fort Donelson and Grant's uncompromising demand brought an avalanche of acclaim to the general from Galena, Ohio. For the Union Army to beat the Confederacy, they would have to take control of the Cumberland River. To do so, they would have to take control of Fort Donelson and the other surrounding forts. Now, the Union Army just came off a win at Fort Henry when they were going to attack Fort Donelson. And the Union Army had a big advantage because the battles are being fought along the riverside, and the Union Army had these gunboats called ironclads, and they were very strong and powerful. But surprisingly, although they had this advantage, the Union Army ended up sinking their gunboats at the Battle of Fort Donelson and caused them to retreat. Now, the Confederacy thought they had the battle won when they did this, and when they tried to escape the fort, surprisingly, the Union Army actually pushed them back into the fort and would eventually cause them to surrender. Now, this was a very big win for the Union because when they took control of Fort Donelson, they ended up gaining control of all the forts along the Cumberland River. So now they had control of that river, which would allow them access to thousands of miles of land and on the river. So this was pretty much my summary of the battle at Fort Donelson. I hope it was easier to understand than the video you just watched. So thank you.